Dark Souls. It's one of my favorite games now, and I did not even get into the series until 2019. At that time, I had my pick. I could have started with Dark Souls 2 or 3, or Bloodborne, or Sekiro, but I chose to go with the original because I remember trying to play Pokemon Red after playing Pokemon Silver, and the downgrade was very upsetting to me. Starting from the start of the series was correct for me because it instilled a love for the series despite some earlier jank that I got to see evolve and improve over time. Elden Ring recently scored Game of the Year 2022. It's gigantic. It's smashing sales numbers of previous Souls games, which means that there are going to be a lot of new From Software fans out there who have not played the earlier titles. It is right to be curious, and there's a rich, delightful world of Souls games awaiting Elden Ring fans to dive in. But I want to help set some expectations in a way that will hopefully avoid the going back to a previous generation of video game ickiness syndrome. These games do share a lot of DNA, but they play differently in a few key ways that I feel is worth cautioning you about for the sake of your enjoyment of Dark Souls. I hope with this video to serve two purposes. One, to provide these cautions, and two, to ultimately convince you, the intrepid Elden Ring player, that it's absolutely worth your time in 2023 tracking down a copy of Dark Souls and seeing where the series came from. Quick notes before we get started. I'm going to use Dark Souls footage for this video, but it's as spoiler-free as possible. You will not see major bosses, especially anything late game, and any environmental footage you do see will be out of context. Weapons will not get spoiled much either because I mostly used a boring plain sword and later a pitchfork, but I guess you'll witness me using pyromancy, so if you consider it a spoiler to see the 10 different permutations of making fire go burn, maybe close your eyes. Also, hello, I'm Jimothy, and welcome to my channel. I'm still small, but I'm doing my best to learn and grow in 2023, so if you end up enjoying the content, I would greatly appreciate a comment or a sub. Specifically, I'd love to hear if I was able to sell any Elden Ring fans on trying out Dark Souls. I'm going to come out of the gate strong. This is an opinion that I hold, and I'm going to need to make the point sometime during this video, so I might as well do it now. Speaking in terms of level design, the world of Dark Souls, Lordran, is much more interesting than the Lands Between from Elden Ring. So Elden Ring has a few great dungeons. There's Stormvale, Volcano Manor, and Noxtella really come to mind for me, but they feel disconnected, spread out across a huge world with a lot of empty fields in between. One of the facets of Dark Souls that propelled it to success was the stunning care put into crafting the interconnected world that plays with vertical level layouts better than any game before or since. Because it's not an open world, every single inch of Lordran is meticulously crafted to excite and amaze you. There's no huge empty field full of lightning goats, there's no mile-long empty beach full of spongy zombie hordes. Instead, you are expected to groom the whole world, because in Dark Souls, if there is a little ledge you can tiptoe around, there will be something there. Usually it's an item, but sometimes a literal entire other half of the area. There's no fast travel in Dark Souls. Try not to see this as an annoyance, but rather as internal consistency. So one of the huge strengths is the amazing world building, and that includes the geography of the zones. But I'm not just talking about aesthetics, it goes way beyond that. The greatest part of Dark Souls level design is when you spend an hour or two in some tough cave that feels infinitely far away, only to step on an elevator and be whooshed back to a safe place you know and love, full of friendly NPCs and calm music that you had not realized was directly above your head the whole time. So don't get annoyed by the lack of fast travel, because the game really wouldn't work without it. It shouldn't be an annoyance because you really can trust there to be a meaningful shortcut back after each long excursion, and the surprise and delight comes in stumbling upon these pathways. Regarding difficulty and balance, in Dark Souls, the area will often be more difficult than the boss that it houses. The game is balanced well so that if you are able to access a boss, then you should have the strength you need to defeat said boss. This is helped beautifully by the previous point about fast travel. It's non-trivial to give up on a boss and come back later, so you're tacitly encouraged to keep making attempts and get better each time, which leads to a huge sense of accomplishment when you do succeed. One thing I really did not love about Elden Ring was how it encouraged you to just give up. Like, you could view it as clever that they placed the difficult tree sentinel directly in front of new players to tutorialize how you can and should sneak by difficult things and come back. But for me, it's precisely that philosophy of giving up and over-leveling elsewhere that hurt Elden Ring. There are so many gank fights, there's multi-bosses, and high-level bosses plopped in low-level areas like an adult crushing the kids at a basketball game. Contrast, in Dark Souls, if you set foot in an area and think, okay, I can handle the small enemies this area is throwing at me, then you are going to be able to beat the boss at the end of that area. Plus, I would say that Dark Souls bosses are a little easier in general, based mostly on their more predictable movesets. You're heavily rewarded for intentionally baiting moves that leave the boss open, such as closing distance to make the boss do a slow butt slam so you can backstep and fire off spells, or standing at medium range to make the boss waste their time on a breath attack only for you to run in and attack it on their sides. But I can sum up all of my feelings on Dark Souls combat in one word because they really nailed this in Dark Souls 1, and it's intentionality. Dark Souls plays a little like a Metroidvania game. Instead of an open world, you're going to have 2 to 4 discrete pathways that you could go down at any time, even through the late game. So maybe you begin the game with a slashing weapon, which you realize is not doing much damage to the skeletons, so you avoid the graveyard for now, and instead try a path with more flesh-based enemies. Maybe you're, for example, dying a lot to a fire boss, so you try a different area instead where you eventually find a fire resistance ring, and now you can go back and have an easy time against the fire boss. Paths in Dark Souls are not explicitly gated with a locked door, but instead they're difficulty gated in a way that repeat players who have a little more skill can sequence break, but beginners have a little bit more of a Metroidvania experience where the paths are effectively blocked until they find a way to handle what is blocking them. There is a much bigger emphasis on solo play in Dark Souls as opposed to Elden Ring. There are no spirit ashes, and while NPC and online summons do exist, it's absolutely a point of pride in the community to succeed without them. But this is not just straight masochism. Elden Ring was designed with co-op a lot more in mind, and you can see that through the large amount of multi-bosses, and also the more lenient summoning rules. Dark Souls is balanced a lot more on one player being able to handle exactly what is given to them, and just barely so. Cooperation is more of an emergency option for if you just cannot progress, rather than an expectation that you use for gameplay. Healing is scarce. You only get 5 Estus flasks every time you rest, and that is it. You can increase this amount sometimes on a per bonfire basis, but those 5 are all you get. Elden Ring is a little more liberal with heals, the way that clearing out groups of enemies refills your flasks and often leaves you health positive after an encounter. In Dark Souls, though, the expected value outcome of any enemy encounter is always negative. But this is not just the way that the game forces difficulty on you. By limiting your healing, there's a fun tension here that isn't often felt in Elden Ring when deciding whether you need to turn back or clowning yourself thinking, geez, there was an unreachable ladder by the last bonfire, the way to lower it has to be around here somewhere, right? And then pressing forward on one healing item left. But going back to rest is never a failure in Dark Souls because you still make progress every excursion. You may have already picked up an item that caused a trap to hit you the first time, or you've killed the pile of Slime Skull's mini-boss who doesn't respawn again. Not to mention just learning enemy placements and the level also does help you next time. It's that careful progress into mastery over an area that really makes the game rewarding, and it's kind of all thanks to the limited heals. There's of course lower weapon diversity in Dark Souls. Elden Ring was a later game, it had a lot more time to make a lot more weapons. In Elden Ring, especially thanks to Ashes of War, you could find a justifiable reason to use most of the weapons in the whole game. Dark Souls has fewer weapons straight up, and most of them are not better or worse than the others, based purely on DPS. The best weapon in Dark Souls is actually the one that you like the moveset the most. That matters a lot more. It's a real consideration that you play in a lot more enclosed areas in Dark Souls, where a halberd swings really wide and it might clink off the walls. So for that reason, I actually favored a spear myself for a long time in my first run, and that struck out very straight ahead of me. There are ways to change up the damage type of your weapon, but gone are the days of every weapon giving a fun and wacky dopamine event when you press L2 because of the lack of weapon skills. This one's a bit of a bummer. There is less freedom with upgrade materials, and this does tie into the lower weapon count. With fewer weapons, you won't need as many materials, but it did have the side effect of making me a bit more judicious when upgrading weapons. I was afraid if I spent all of my Titanite on a Demon Spear, only to just find a new boss weapon in 5 minutes that I then won't have the materials to upgrade. It does eventually become trivial to get the first several levels of a new weapon, but you may end up needing to farm if you do change your mind more than 1 or 2 times after upgrading your weapons a fair amount within Dark Souls. Sadly, pure casting is less viable as a build in Dark Souls. Now, veterans of the game are going to strongly disagree, but they're going to know where everything is after playing the game a couple of times. Casting is absolutely powerful, whether it's sorceries, miracles, or pyromancies, but getting the better spells often involves convoluted NPC quest lines, sometimes across multiple areas, so for a blind play, it can be really rough as a caster. Even finding the equipment for casting can take a pretty long time if you check out the wrong places first, so I will say that if you do want to main a caster in Dark Souls, I highly recommend picking one of the starting classes who comes able to cast spells. This last section is just a bunch of random nitty-gritty points about playing Dark Souls, contrasted with Elden Ring. Nothing here is going to convince you to play the game. They're just a rapid-fire list of changes to expect if you start playing Dark Souls after Elden Ring to save you some head-scratching and Googling. Weapons have durability. It doesn't really have a huge effect on gameplay, but do remember to repair every couple of rests. There's no larval tears and no ability to respec, importantly. You have to choose your stats and stick to a plan in Dark Souls. While there are cases for hybrid builds if you know what you're doing, for a blind first play, I would strongly suggest you're better served by picking your shtick early on. You can pretty much do a strength build, dexterity build, sorcery build, or a miracle build. The game is also just a lot slower. You'll walk more as opposed to running because of lethal drops everywhere. Turtling is highly effective for yourself or for shield-bearing enemies, and combat is a lot more about careful bait and response rather than kind of mad rolling and jumping. These status effects are all different. Poison does not suck. Toxic exists, and that's like hyperpowered poison. And importantly, bleed is not the powerhouse it was in Elden Ring. Bleed is aimed a little bit more at PvP, since part of its effect is stamina damage, which enemies don't have. There's less diversity of damage types. Lightning is good for enemies with scales, fire is good for fleshy things, and there's also magic when the other two don't apply. But there's no hidden Godslayer type, there's no holy damage, or some others that Elden Ring had. It was a little true in Elden Ring, but more so here that physical damage type matters a lot, though. The slashing damage from your sword might bounce off of hard enemies in a way that a striking mace or a piercing spear would not. Selling isn't a thing, so expect your duplicate equipment to molder in your inventory unless you lock it away in your storage chest. There's sort of an exception to this later, but for the couple of souls you recoup compared to the time you spent managing your inventory, you're better off just doing a quick farming loop instead. Tiny word of caution, don't pick the master key as your starting gift. That key enables a few key sequence breaks for speedrunning or for pro players, but a new player will have a better time experiencing the areas in a normal intended progression. Lastly, I do recommend, if you're going back at all, that you play Dark Souls 1 instead of starting with 3 or 2. It's true 3 is going to play the most like Elden Ring, but I really do think 1 is a masterpiece, and it just gets a little different with each subsequent entry, and experiencing that progression is quite valuable. Not to mention plot reasons. There's a 2018 remaster of Dark Souls 1 available on recent gen consoles, and it plays great. So that's it. Overall, Elden Ring players going back to Dark Souls should expect a slower, more careful game. The biggest obvious difference is the lack of fast travel, but if you're able to appreciate that for the immersion rather than get mad about it, you should find yourself right at home going back to the earlier game. Thank you so much for watching. If there is interest after this video, I may create a follow-up for playing Dark Souls 2 after 1, which, since it's a direct sequel, would just cover more nitty-gritty differences like changes to status effects or how dodge rolls work. Otherwise, enjoy the world of Dark Souls and have a blessed day.